Hello and welcome on in, everybody, to Pro Tips. I am your host, Sam Peterson, and we're going to be talking about blending modes today, specifically blending modes and how I use them in my illustration, concept art, digital painting workflow. So if you want the full comprehensive breakdown of all the blending modes, what they do, I can put a couple links in chat. One is an official Adobe link that's going to break them down. The other is from Photoshop training channel from the one and only Jesus Ramirez. So if you want a really comprehensive look at all of them, check that out. But we're specifically going to be talking about what I use in my illustration workflow. So let me show you the document we're working with first and foremost here. This is what we're using, or this is the example image I'm going to show you today. So this is actually a painting that I did based off a previous stream I did here on Adobe. I don't know if any of you caught that, but it was called something like Shape Language for Character Design, and I did some thumbnails for different characters. Well, I actually took one of those thumbnails that was very rough and I worked it up into a finished painting. And this is what the painting looks like. This is like after everything, after it's been polished and rendered and all that. But this is what you can do, and this is what I'm going to show you today with just blending modes. So this is what the piece looks like before I ever started painting opaquely on top of it. And this is the preliminary buildup layers I do with various blending modes to get the lighting worked out. So this is the finished painting, and this is kind of what you could achieve with the layers that we're going to talk about today. So what you would need to get started is you'd want something like this. I have a character drawing that I did. You know, the lines aren't super clean, but they're clean enough that you can see the different edges and everything. You can see where the different shapes end and start and overlap. And then you would want to create a mask. So for the character, I created this mask, which I basically just painted a shape underneath the line layer. And then I have one more layer on top of that clipped to my mask, that is flat colors. And this is what you'd need to get started, and this is where we're going to pick up today. I just wanted to say hey to everyone before I really get going with this. What's up, Wade? It looks like Wade's modded today. We got RB, General Kenobi, Steve, good to see you. Carol, Clarissa, Robert, what's up, everybody? Patrick, thanks for joining. Appreciate it. Good to see you all. And let me jump into the first blending mode that we're going to talk about today, which is the multiply layer. So this is going to be like a shadow layer. I'll name it multiply 2, just to kind of label each blending mode that we'll be using. Now, when I create shadows, what I like to do is I like to select a color that's a little bit more than 50% gray, very desaturated, and I usually go with like a purple blue. Now, if you're using a warm light source, you're going to want cool shadows, so that's why I'm going with purple. I like to have a little bit more red in it because it looks good on skin tones. If it's too blue sometimes and too desaturated, sometimes it looks a bit muddy. So I like to get a decent amount of red in there, which kind of gives you this purple pink color. And when you paint onto it, you can kind of paint over and see like, okay, that looks like it's in shadow, so that's working for us. So I'm gonna click this, right click my layer, my shadow layer, and do create clipping mask to clip it to the group that we have there for the mask. Now you can do this, you can kind of carve in your shadows with a hard brush. It works kind of graphically. Sometimes I like to plan out my shadows in a more graphic way and then go through later and clean them up and soften them. So with that, I would select the smudge tool, and I could go in after sort of carving in the shadows and just soften up the edges where I want it. Now that's one method. Alternatively, you could use a soft brush. But if you do want to try out the smudge tool method, I just have a soft round brush for my smudge brush. Its strength is set at 50%. And if you go into the brush settings, scattering is checked on and set to 10%. I also have spacing set to 25. The less spacing you have and the more scattering you have, the more system intensive the smudge brush will be. So I don't use it at a very big size. I keep it pretty small, otherwise it can kind of lag my computer. Just a little warning, if you guys are cranking those settings up, it might get a little intense. So what you could also do is you could just go in with a soft round brush here and kind of block out these different areas or sort of fade in some shadow for these different areas. You could be a lot more general with this, doing these big like sweeping gradients. Maybe I want the legs a little more in shadow. You can erase that out too if you went too far. Another thing you can do, which I use this a lot, is utilize your flat color layers here. So these are all different sections. So what I can do is I can just grab those with the magic wand tool. I actually use the magic wand tool all the time for this purpose. But say I just want to grab her shoulder pad. Well, first off, I can click contiguous to localize it to that one area. If you uncheck contiguous, it'll grab everything of that color. So I'm going to click it on. I'm just going to grab this shoulder pad, hold on shift to add that other part to it. And from here, I could kind of, just paint in on that shoulder pad. So it gives you a lot of control for these shadows, since you could separate these objects. So I use this all the time. If I want her glove, I'll just grab that black glove because it's all one color. The tolerance for my magic wand is set at 10. That tends to work pretty well for me. Now, this method lends itself really well to a process that I always start off with when I'm doing shadows. So I'm going to hide this shadow layer, and I'm going to create a new one. And I call this Ambient Occlusion. This is going to be a multiply layer, as are all my shadow blending modes. Hey, what's up, Peter? Good to see you. So for Ambient Occlusion, I use this method a lot. Ambient Occlusion is essentially all the little nooks, crannies, and overlapping shapes where light has a hard time bouncing into. So light gets diffused, it bounces around, and ambient occlusion is essentially those areas that the light has a very difficult time getting into. So I'm going to select the jacket, and I'm going to uncheck contiguous so I can get the whole green of the jacket. There we go. I'm going to hide that with Control Command H. This is a common method I use. And then I'm going to go to my ambient occlusion layer. I tend to lock all my other layers. That's a good rule of thumb so you're not painting on the wrong layers. And if I take away the lines, you might be able to see it a bit more. But I just try to get a little bit of shadow peeking out from those nooks and crannies and overlapping shapes. And this is something that actually gives a really convincing sense of 3D form, but it takes a while just to kind of go throughout it. So since I have this jacket selected, I might as well do it where the pouch overlaps. You do it underneath these pouches. And it's really just where a lot of these objects are overlapping. Now, what helps is using the lasso tool when you need it, because this crevice here where the fold of the glove kind of goes over, it's all one color, so I can't use the magic wand to select it. So I might just use the lasso tool, hide it with Control Command H, press B for brush, maybe hide my lines if I want to be able to see it better. It's this little series of hotkeys I use when I'm doing this method, but it kind of becomes muscle memory the more you do it. I can do a little bit of that. I could even shade it a bit, make it a bit bigger and get a little bit more of a gradation going. Let's make sure we clip that layer to our group. And this works really well for things like, the skin, since it's all kind of one tone, there's no like clear edges. I'll just do this kind of loosely. Hit it with Control Command H, hide the lines. We can kind of get this sort of shadowy effect for the ear to give it a bit more. You can also go in under the chin. See if I can do a clean selection. You can always adjust your selection holding on Shift to add, holding on Alter Option to subtract. But I think that looks good enough. Hide the selection, hide my lines, kind of go and get a little shadow there. So ambient occlusion has a lot of power to add a lot of convincing depth. I can show you what that looks like in the finished version. If I turn off all my other lighting layers, this is the ambient occlusion layer being turned on and off. So you can see when you work it up a bit, it gives some nice depth. So that's a multiply layer, and that's one of the first shadows I do. That's what it looks like on its own. You can see I use some different tones, different colors. So it's a little messy looking, but it adds some nice depth. So let's turn these back on, hide this. And now from here, I don't typically do a shadow layer the way I showed you first. This is a method where you're adding shadow into flat colors, and that's probably a very familiar method for most people because it's kind of like how you draw with pencil. You shade from light to dark. I work a slightly different way. I would say try them out. This might be something that you really like. This might be the most comfortable one for you. What I do is I do that ambient occlusion layer, and then I create another shadow layer. So I'm going to do shadows, and that's a multiply layer. So I'm just labeling these for clarity. And I actually want to make sure I clip it first. but I fill the whole thing in with a shadow tone. So let's make sure I don't have a selection, Control or Command D. There we go. And now the whole thing's darkened down. And what I can do from here is I can create a color dodge layer. And now this is getting into the lighting layers. So we talked about multiply, let's get into color dodge. I'll actually name this key light and color dodge to label it. Hey, what's up, Seta? Good to see you. Welcome on in. I want to make sure I select color dodge. So from here, what I can do is select a color. I talked about our multiply color. For color dodge, I want to go a lot darker, keep it about the same saturation, and I want to choose a warm color because we're going for a warm light. If you have like moonlight or something that's cool, I would try like a blue instead of this kind of orangey, really desaturated orange. So I tried that, a little too dark. Let's put that up a bit here. There, and from here I can clip this. Let's delete that and start over, and I can basically just start blocking in the lighting. I like working graphically just so I know, where my light's coming from. It's also very important to have a direction in mind for your lighting. For the ambient occlusion is going to be the same for all lighting situations. But when you're doing lighting and you're keeping in mind a direction, pick one direction and stick with it. I think that's a common mistake you see people make, is they don't have consistent lighting. So I'm basically just blocking in everywhere I think the light will hit. I'm doing this with a hard brush. I could go in with my smudge tool, kind of soften it up a bit. This is just a method I like. I feel like it gives me some precision on exactly what edges I want hard and soft. It might be weird for some of you, so you could always just go to a soft brush and kind of try to erase out where you want the shadow, paint in where you want the light. But the thing is, with the ambient occlusion, you're always going to have those deep shadows still preserved, and that's what you want, because those are always going to be there regardless of the lighting. You could even do some bounce light in the hair and that kind of thing. Maybe a little shadow on the goggles. So that's kind of how I use color dodge to block in my main light source. You might also have, since this is a key light, it's sort of a photography term. You might also have like a bounce light. You could do that on a separate layer. One thing that I do often is a rim light, also referred to as a hair light, I believe, in photography sometimes. So let's do a rim light. And this is going to be not a color dodge, but it's going to be a linear dodge. So I like to put all my light sources on different layers just to keep it very easy to edit later on. So we're going to do rim light, and I'll do linear dodge. And you'll see the mode is linear dodge add. Now for this one, let me select a color here. I want to go pretty extreme with the saturation. You can do a rim light whatever color you want. I like to do contrasting colors sometimes, so a blue might look nice because everything else is warm. And you can kind of see how this looks. I like linear dodge over color dodge for rim lights because you'll see color dodge, there's a bit more value fluctuation. When we go to linear dodge, it's a little more opaque, so it works across different surfaces and materials of the character a little bit more consistently. I find that this looks a little abrupt, but you could totally use color dodge if you want. Personally, I like linear dodge. So let's clip that to the character, delete it, and then we'll kind of repaint it here. So keep in mind the direction of your rim light as well. You always want to keep in mind the direction. I'm thinking, let's say it's coming from the bottom right. So how would that be hitting these surfaces? Just be hitting the bottom of this shoulder pad, maybe peeking in here a bit. And I like to rough it in very, very loosely before I clean it up. That way I can see if it even looks good. Like, is this layout good? And that's kind of a rule of thumb I do for most of these layers. I like to block them in pretty roughly, maybe with the exception of ambient occlusion, because that's always going to be kind of the same. But for flat colors, for my lighting layers, I always like to sort of block it in like this to see, does that even look good? Because if it doesn't, you didn't spend much time on it. You can always adjust it from there. So I think something like that might work. Kind of zoom out, look at it. I'm like, yeah, that looks cool. So we could go forward with that. So that is our ambient occlusion layer, which is our shadow. I don't have a lot of it here, but you saw it in the example. I have my key light, which is a color dodge layer, and I have my rim light, which is a linear dodge. From there, sometimes what I like to do, I don't use this one as often, but let me give you a clear example here, is sometimes the core shadows might look bit too muddy, and I'm not a huge fan of that. Maybe I want to warm them up. What I've used on occasion is a lighter color layer to add more saturation into core shadows. And for skin tones, I find that that oftentimes gives them a bit more life if you feel like they are looking muddy. Like I said, this isn't something I always use, but it's a nice tool to have if you need it. So I'm going to color pick the skin tone that's not in shadow. I might make it a little bit more saturated, just a little bit darker, so it just affects the shadows, maybe more towards red. But you see that, how it kind of warms up? It's not affecting the skin tone. It's only affecting tones darker than it. So I might, brush on a little bit of saturation there and, erase it from the mouth. And now this is a hard edge, so it looks a little odd, but you can kind of see how you can add some warmth into those core shadows, which can be really nice. We could even go through and soften up that edge if we want, but it's a nice tool to have when you need it to add a little bit more life into the skin. So let's see. From here we covered ambient occlusion, which is a multiply. We covered shadows, which is also multiplied, the general shadows. Key light, which is color dodge. Rim light, which is linear dodge. And the lighter color layer if you want to add a bit more saturation to those core shadows. From here, what you can do, and the beauty of this is that you can add in, or you can edit these layers after the fact. So if you feel like your key light is too dark or too light, I can go and do it. I'm just doing a levels adjustment. You can always crank that up, darken it down, and adjust it and fine tune it. You could go into the colors and change the colors after the fact as well. So if you want to take the colors, you can change them. And the great thing is, like, no matter what colors you do, the lighting is always going to be there. So if I just want to select the hair and I'm like, I'm not feeling the orange hair, we could try something else. We could even just, go into the hue and saturation. Like, oh, I think she looks cool with like aqua hair, aqua blue. The nice thing is if you spent some time working up those shadow layers and those lighting layers, all that information is going to be retained. So you have that flexibility to change any one of these layers, brightness, color, any of that, after you have it blocked out. So I think that's a really nice, like, flexible workflow before you commit to something. Let me see. Let's talk about texture a bit. So I'm going to go into our more finished block out. This is where all the layers are worked up without any painting. But I spent a bit of time on it. So what I could do is I could use some photo textures. I don't typically use photo textures in my workflow, but if you do, this adds a lot of flexibility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint or paste this metal texture. I'm going to right click it. We'll do, let's see. What do we want to do here? See if I can select this. Oh, my folder's locked. That's why. Couldn't get the selection. There we go. So what I want to do is I want to right click this and do convert to smart object, scale it way down, and we're going to use this on the shoulder pad. That looks pretty good. I'm going to right click it and do create clipping mask. We'll clip it to this area. And what I can do is I can use the flat selection, the flat colors of this. If I hide this, I can just select the flat color layer, just the shoulder pad. Let's isolate that like we talked about before, and I can actually mask it out on this. And what you can do is you could actually, let me see here. You can click this little chain between the mask and between the layer, and you should be able to click the layer and move it around there. So now it's not restrained. And kind of get the positioning you like. Now from here, I would just flip through the different blending modes and see what looks good. For textures, I find that multiply, screen, soft light, and hard light often look good. But let's try this out and see which ones look the best. Now, overlay, I think that looks pretty good. And this is soft light, which I think looks pretty good. Hard light's a bit too intense, but I oftentimes find these are good. One just has a bit more contrast, so I could always just take that overlay and tone it down a bit. And there we got like a bit of texture on top of it. You could put this on top of a painting, or alternatively, we could do this. Let's try a leather texture. And let's put that on top. Right click it. Convert to smart object so I can scale this way down for the pouch. And let's try this over the pouch here. I'm going to clip it to my mask, great clipping mask. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go to my flat layer, my color flats, select that pouch, and create a mask. Now from here, I can try out different blending modes like we talked about, but you might run into some situations where you don't find any of the blending modes to quite have the look that you want. None of these are quite working with the colors that I have below. So what I could do instead is I could actually leave it as a normal layer, click and drag it down underneath all the lighting layers. So underneath the ambient occlusion layer. Now, all those layers like the ambient occlusion, the shadow, the key light, and the rim light are all on top of the texture. So it's being affected by all those lighting layers that we did. So you could put it on the very top, find a blending mode that works good, or you could put it beneath all of them and just keep it on normal. So in the case of this leather texture, that might actually be what looks best. And then I would just adjust the opacity for that. And then that could be a good base. And you could, you could do that for all your materials here if you like using photo textures. So I use overlay, soft light, hard light, sometimes multiply for textures. It just depends on the image and the material specifically. You'll kind of have to play with it as you go and see what works best. You can also play around with opacity, the blend if sliders, things like that give you a lot of flexibility. So let me see what we have left here. We might also have some background textures. If you want to put something in the background, let's say we want to use this texture. I could add this into my background. And if it has a black background, you can use like a screen blending mode here. So I use this a lot. It's much more visible if you have, if you have a darker background. So if we take this background, make it like a darker blue color, you'll see this a lot more. Same thing with this. This one has more of a black background directly. Now we could take this, put it down here, and if we change this to screen, you can utilize screen blending modes for any sort of texture that might have a black background. And that's a method I use pretty frequently. Let me see here. What do we have time for? So I want to talk about screen blending modes more. I use this for all my magic effects. Since we don't have time today, I could just show you this. Let's see if we even have time for this. If we don't, check out my Instagram. You can go to my Instagram Reels. And
hey guys,
you can check out
I've gotten this question
how to
a few
paint
times,
magical
so
effects
I'm going to go ahead
video.
and show you how I make magical spell effects in Photoshop. First, start by making a new layer, set the blending mode to screen, and fill it with black.
That's the screen blending
Then
mode we
make
use.
another new layer, leave it as a normal layer, and this will be the layer that we paint on. Lastly, create a new gradient map adjustment layer and clip the second two layers to the first screen layer. Now you can set the gradient map to the colors you want the effect to be, but the key thing is you have to make sure that the gradient starts with black or it won't work. Now that you have a gradient selected, you can go to the paint layer and start painting with white. I like to use a hard round brush and then smudge it to create different levels of opacity which correspond to the different colors.
So that's the gist of it. Check it out. It's on my Instagram Reels if you want to see more. I just wanted to talk about a couple more resources before we go. There's some really cool images from artists. This is by an artist named Devin Platts. I wanted to link this in the chat. You can see he breaks down these different blending modes. He actually puts multiply layer, screen layer, and you can see how all these are built up to create a final product. He also has a tutorial out there on Gumroad if you want to search it, but there's some really cool info. There's this artist, Johannes Helgeson, that has some really cool stuff here. And yeah, just a lot of great resources out there. I'd also check out John Park. He did all this lighting. You can check out his Instagram with different adjustment layers and blending modes. But that's it for me for today. I do have to run. Hopefully you found this helpful. Thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you guys next time I see you. Bye, everybody.